And with me, I have two special guests. I have Julie Olson and Salena Rothenberger. So, Julie, I've actually interviewed Julie already, but I'm going to give another brief intro here. So, Julie is a triple certified evidence based nutrition expert, and she specializes in female hair loss, gut health, and gluten issues. With more than 10 years' experience, collaboration with functional and integrative practitioners, along with her training in functional medicine, Julie has transformed over 700 women's health and hair. And then we also have Salena. So Salena is a certified functional medicine practitioner, certified health coach, and obtained certification in nutrigenomics through Nutrigenetic Research Institute. She has studied an additional 300 plus hours in functional immunology, autoimmunity clinical strategies, and other functional and herbal medicine related training. She is the founder of the Functional Perspective, where she teaches individuals how to connect their genomics with their health to create a strategy for a clear path to restored wellness. And her mission is to redefine healthcare by providing others clarity, action steps, resources, and empowerment. Thank you for joining me, Julie and Salena.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure chatting with both of you about hair loss. And Salena is going to be the one really giving the presentation on a nutrigenomic approach to hair loss. And then we're going to be doing some Q&A. So if there are questions, definitely let us know. You could start entering those in the comments. I also gave people the opportunity to email the questions. And so I do have some email questions as well. So without further ado, Salena, I'm going to let you take over here.
Okay, fantastic. So like Eric said, this is a nutrigenomic approach to hair loss. There's a lot of ways to look at hair loss, but what we're going to talk about today is the genetic side and what does nutrigenomics have to do with that. So overall, we're going to discuss some of the underlying causes of female hair loss, the role that our genetic DNA and the SNPs especially play in that, and the nutrigenomics side of that. So genetics and nutrigenomics is different. We're going to talk a little bit about that, and then how we can be more proactive and preventative in a nutrigenomic approach to hair loss. So just real quick, Eric already kind of, talked about who I am, so I'm not going to really go over that again, but my mission is that redefining healthcare. And so that's kind of what we're doing today. Why I am passionate about this is my son was diagnosed with autoimmunity in 2014, and that set me on a journey to understand why. And then that has spilled over into so many things, especially the genes side of things, is understanding what influenced him to get autoimmunity. And then it's branched out into many other things like working with Julie and women that have hair loss. The honest truth is about hair loss, over 50% of women are affected by hair loss by age 50. The management of this is very challenging, frustrating. Most are just going to be relegated to lifelong pharmaceuticals or things that never do give them full restoration of their hair, are very expensive, and they come with drastic side effects. So that begs the question as to what are we missing? What else can we be doing differently? Is there a natural way that we can approach this? So looking at the root causes of hair loss, it really opens up into so many different things. And so what Julie, I think, spoke about before with Dr. Eric was about these many different things of the underlying causes like chronic inflammation, detoxification issues, nutrient deficiencies, gut imbalances, candida, fungal overgrowth, poor circulation, pathogens, autoimmunity, bacterial infections. The list goes on and on as to what are all of these underlying issues. So what is that common denominator? That common denominator comes down to inflammation and how our body resolves inflammation, or where does inflammation come from? And that's where genomics comes into play, because that inflammation is part of our metabolic processes. That's where those genes that are going to, fuel those systems and increase the inflammation in that response to restore balance. So just a quick kind of overview of the metabolic pathways are just really magnificent. I mean, if you look at them on a chart, they're just like, it's just a chart of you can't really discern it unless you really zoom in. So we're just going to kind of pull back and not really get into all these genetics, so we could talk for days on them. The four key areas, especially when we're looking at hair loss, are things surrounding the digestive system, fatty acid and nutrient metabolism, the immune response, and the body's ability to resolve the inflammation response. Those four key areas touch and play a role on pretty much every single underlying cause of women's hair loss or even male hair loss. So many want to know, what is a SNP? unfortunately, with the MTHFR craze, a lot more people are familiar with a genetic SNP, but just for a review, for those who are not, a genetic SNP is a polymorphism, so a single nucleotide polymorphism. We get 2 genetic variants one from each parent. And so we can have a wild type, we can have a normal or a heterozygous. And so with that, excuse me, I was sick earlier this week, and so I'm kind of just coming off of having a really bad cold. So with that, we're going to get either a wild type, which is our normal gene, a heterozygous is 1 variation, or we're going to have a homozygous, which is 2 variations. So they don't necessarily always mean that we have a variant is a bad thing. It just sometimes can mean that there's a problem. So it comes with my favorite illustration with Dr. Tara Scott. If any of you know her, hormone guru, I think Dr. Eric interviewed her some time back. She has a great illustration with understanding the genes and how these polymorphisms can play a role. So if you were going to a doctor and you thought you were going to see Dr. Joy Scott, but in comes Dr. J Scott, that one single letter was switched, and now you have a male doctor. So you might be like, oh, I was expecting a woman, but they both have the same function. They have the same training. They can still help you. So that really doesn't make much of a difference. It does have a little bit of a change of the meaning, but it doesn't change the function. But if you take cat and cut and you change that middle vowel, those are very, very different. And so those do have a big impact on how these genes function. And so there's other types of genes. There's 2 kind of main types of genes. We have our metabolic genes, and then we also have our characteristic genes. The characteristic ones are sort of like, where we're from, what color is our hair, our eyes, those kinds of things. We don't really able to influence those kind of genes. We're not going to be talking about those genes. There are a lot of genes that are considered the disease genes. And that disease genes, there's a big gray area in that as well, because as we learn more and more about genetics, it's really at these metabolic genes and the genes that we can influence through epigenetics that we can change the course of our health for the good or for the bad. So again, just to recap that, we have the heterozygous, the homozygous, and the wild type of our genes, and one comes from each parent. And so when the epigenetics come into play with that, it's about the context. So we could have perfectly fine genes, but if we're in a bad scenario, we still will put a lot of stress on those genes and those pathways. And the same when if we have a predisposed disposition, if we have that homozygous, and most times that's a decrease in function, not always, some of them are upregulated. And we're going to actually talk about some of those exceptions where that upregulation, which is regarding to inflammation specifically. But if we have, for instance, a genetic SNP, and it's like taking your 4-lane highway, which is your perfect little highway, down to a 1-lane highway, well, that's going to kind of slow down traffic. But having that 4-lane highway in the context, if you're in LA traffic in the middle of rush hour, you're still going to be at a standstill, where that 1-lane highway in the middle of West Texas, you'll be going crazy fast. So it's also about context. That's what epigenetics is. And that's what we're going to really talk about today is the epigenetic factors. How can we influence our metabolism genes and these other genes that play a role in leading to those causes of hair loss? So again, the 4 issues we're going to talk about, the first ones is the digestive health genes. So the things like the FUT2s, your IL-21, IL-13, these are the interleukin genes. They play a big role in the immune response, but also in digestion. The IL-21 family, you hear a lot about the gluten. The HLA family, also, there's a bunch of those with gluten related. There's some other HLAs that are not specifically gluten related, but are specifically to hair loss, especially women's hair loss. HNMT gene, which is a histamine-related gene, that also plays a big role in your digestive health, which can lead to chronic hair loss when your digestive system's not working well. So many things can fall apart, and hair loss is one of those things that happen. ABP1, which is most commonly known as DAO, diamine oxidase, that helps to degrade histamine in your GI tract. That one gets very compromised with excess inflammation. So if you have a genetic polymorphism, a SNP in that ABP1 gene, and you don't make enough DAO to begin with, you add a lot of histamine, you add a lot of inflammation, or you have parasites, gut dysbiosis. Now that gene that wasn't even working very well, you have that 1-lane highway in the middle of that East LA traffic. So it's really not a good situation. MAOA and B, those also are related to histamine as well as our neurotransmitter health. And that's where we see a lot of times with women's health, there's this overlap between neurohealth and other symptoms like hair loss or PMS or any sort of your cycle issues, your female hormone issues. There's a huge connection between those. The other section that's a really crucial section is your fatty acid metabolism and your nutrient metabolism. And again, this goes to that digestive health is where we get those nutrients, but if we can't actually metabolize them and process them, things still can fall apart. Fatty acids are super, super important because anytime we have inflammation, we need that fat to repair. And our cells are made up of the fatty acids. That structure on the outside of to keep those membranes are dependent on healthy fats. So if we can't process, digest, and utilize fats, everything can fall apart, especially with our hair, especially with women's hormones. So many things. I would basically say that about everything, especially with everything. So the PMT gene is a big one for women because that one is actually stimulated also by estrogen. So we see a lot of times women that have the PMT SNPs. This takes phosphatidylethylmolamine, converts it into phosphatidylcholine, but estrogen can promote that SNP and kind of accentuate that SNP. And so when you no longer have the estrogen, as you get to that menopause, we see a lot of symptoms that will creep up. And all of a sudden, we're like, what happened? I was fine, went into menopause, no more estrogen, and now there's a mess. Almost always we're finding, at least the ones that I work with a lot of hormones issues, there are some PMT SNPs there. So that's a really, really big one for women's health. PANK1, your FADs, fatty acid desaturates, these are all going to be with your omega-3s, your omega-6s, and sometimes it's the omega-6 issue, and it's actually not having enough omega-6s or the right omega-6. There's a part of the omega-6 pathway that's actually very anti-inflammatory. Unfortunately, we have fried foods and a lot of, not so good foods that create a lot of oxidative fats. And so, but with women, if you have the PMT SNPs, some of these FAD SNPs, that just puts you at a really big risk for not having healthy fats. That's also going to translate into your hair and all of your skin, and all of your cells in your body are just going to be compromised because you don't have healthy fat metabolism. There's several others here: carnitine, SLC22A5, your CYPs, you see a lot of those with your estrogen. BTD is your biotin. Biotin in hair health is very, very well known and established. When you have biotin SNPs, that pathway is not working well, and again, puts you at a higher risk for female hair loss. SEP1, VDR, BCMO1, these have to do with selenium, which is really super important for thyroid health, and that's part of that overlap of seeing that with women's hair loss, and you see a lot of times that hair loss with thyroid dysfunction. VDR has to do with your vitamin D. Everyone pretty much today knows how important vitamin D is with all the sickness that's been going around the last couple of years. BCMO1 has to do with vitamin A. Again, this is very important with the immune response. Many of the hair loss issues have to do with autoimmunity. And so if your immune system's not working well and is not supplied well, these genetic SNPs play a huge role when you have that one-lane highway, again, in that LA traffic. The immune and inflammatory response, these are ones I probably focus a lot on, or the most, the IL-13 and especially the IL-6. The IL-6 plays a huge role in resolving inflammation and in the immune response. There's an inflammation response. Transforming growth factor beta is a big one, something that I always test for with almost every single person that I work with. If that TGF beta is crazy high, sometimes the anti-inflammatories will actually work against you as opposed to for you. So seeing if we have that IL-6 SNP, that one is actually an upregulated SNP in almost every scenario. So if you have that homozygous, instead of being a one-lane highway, now you have like an 8-lane highway going crazy fast down a mountain. We don't want to be going 80 miles an hour down a mountain. We'll go flying off a cliff. So again, it's about context. If we have this upregulation on that IL-6, that means that we can have a lot more inflammation. Our body is overprotective. It's going to send out a lot more of that inflammatory response in an attempt to help protect you. But now you have to resolve it after it does its job. And that's where you kind of get stuck if you don't now have the fats to kind of repair that it's over too much inflammation. The SALT genes have with your sulfur transferases. These are part of your detoxification pathways, super important. The entire glutathione family, all of those genes play a huge role, especially any that have to do with detoxifying estrogen, like your GST, or recycling glutathione, your GSR. Estrogen and any of your steroid hormones are very well connected with female hair loss. The glutathione family is a huge part of that because you have to detox your estrogen just as you have to detox heavy metals or any other toxin. So if you can't detox your estrogen, you get stuck with a very damaging type form of estrogen, can be very problematic. Your NOS family, which is your nitric oxide, this has to do with your integrity of your cardiovascular system. How well are you supplying the fuel to your blood cell, the blood throughout your body, your bloodstream? So super, super important, that NOS family. If we have SNPs here, again, we are usually at a much higher increased risk for inflammatory issues and not being able to resolve the inflammatory response. HFE has to do with your iron. And again, this one has a big crossover also with thyroid dysfunction, because iron is needed for your tyrosine pathway. It's also needed for the inflammatory pathway, but if it's out of balance, it's way too much of a good thing. MTHFR, which many people have probably heard of. And one thing I want to caution about MTHFR is if you have an MTHFR gene that takes your folate, and it's part of that last step of converting to methylfolate, which is your active form that your body can use, you don't just go out and treat that SNP. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of genes and many more thousands of variants of those. So we cannot just go treat every single polymorphism. We have to look at the context. But MTHFR plays a huge role in the women's hair loss and in many of your chronic diseases because of the step that it's at in methylation. Methylfolate combines with methyl B12, zinc, and homocysteine. They keep folate pathway working, they keep the B12 pathway working, and they keep the methionine, which is, and all of those are the methylation cycle. If any one of those steps is compromised, there's a domino effect that almost always happens. However, it's more than just, okay, go take methylfolate, because you need other things such as your B3s or your B1 or other vitamins to keep those pathways. So we push with methylfolate and we don't have enough of our NAD family of enzymes to recycle that folate. Again, we can be stuck creating more problems than we fix. SOD and catalase are in the same family or the same type of genes as your glutathione. So glutathione is your body's master antioxidant. It's 10,000 times more powerful than the antioxidants we eat. The antioxidants we eat are like a 1-to-1 ratio of inflammation. The glutathione is like 10,000 to 1. So we need our body making glutathione to detox us and to resolve inflammation. If everything was perfect in a very perfect world, we would still have inflammation. Just as our vehicles have an exhaust system that has inflammation, our bodies have inflammation. It's part of the energy transform that gives our body energy that we can live and breathe. There's an inflammatory component, but we have to be able to resolve that. Glutathione is one of the big things that does that. SOD and catalase also are part of that. So SOD takes oxide, superoxide, and makes hydrogen peroxide. Catalase will help clear out that hydrogen peroxide. Glutathione also will clear out the hydrogen peroxide. One of the important things to kind of note on this is the hydrogen peroxide is also created with our B12 cycle. So to convert the B12 to methylcobalamin, hydrogen peroxide is also produced. So if we push the methylcobalamin and methylfolate, we're going to create hydrogen peroxide in that process. If we can't clear it out, we're going to have excess hydrogen peroxide. A lot of times you will see people that have the women with gray hair, even men with gray hair, but the early graying hair is often tied to excess hydrogen peroxide. So always I'm looking at the SOD and catalase genes to see where are the SNPs in those. Is someone more predisposed for issues there? These last couple, I'm going to talk about HCY and the NQO1. Those two are not necessarily directly tied to women's hair loss, but they do play a huge role in methylation and the resolving the inflammatory immune response as a whole. Anytime I see genetic SNPs in those two categories, there's always a lot of wrenches in the gears, and things that should happen don't happen. And so there's a lot more guessing that happens, or you tend to be the type of people that you've tried protocol after protocol after protocol, and it seems like you keep spinning your wheels. Usually that HCY, which is a step before homocysteine, there's some SNPs there, or the NQO1. They just, for whatever reason, there's another set is the UGT genes. They seem to just kind of throw some of those curveballs at you. So I'd like to mention those so people can be aware and be on the lookout for those genes. The other ones that I want to kind of touch on are the estrogen metabolism. And these are super important when it comes to women's hair loss because it's almost always some sort of hormonal imbalance as well. So besides the digestive issues, usually the hormones are one of the first things to go. COMT has to do with your estrogen as well as your dopamine. And that's where also we will see the overlap between a lot of neurosymptoms with women surrounding their periods and surrounding their cycles because of that estrogen, and that COMT gene will get slowed down with the polymorphisms there. All the different CYPs, the CYP 19A1 or the 1A1, 1A2, 1B1, all of those play a big role in that metabolism of estrogen. HSD 17B1, the SALT families 1A1, 1E1, 2A1, and there's several in that UGT family that I just mentioned, the 1A1, 1A3, 1A4, 1A8, 1A9, and 2B7. So that whole section has to do with estrogen, and ones that I really strongly encourage people looking at, anyone who's looking into hair loss or anything women's hormone related. So what can we do? What proactive steps can we take? Inflammation should be the top of the list for everyone who has some sort of hair loss symptoms. That inflammation, if we don't resolve that, we can never get back to the steps of our body rebuilding and regrowing hair. We need to be considering genetic testing, especially for those who have tried some things and they're still having very persistent symptoms. The epigenetic modulation from inflammation and digestive health is very effective. There's lots and lots of studies of how we can influence these genes. Pretty much every pharmaceutical is based on some gene, these metabolic genes, how they will block them or upregulate them. We can also do those things with natural methods. So we really need to take a preventative approach to women's hair loss. And that's pretty much what I have. And if I take any questions or if there's anything you guys want to expand on, I'm happy to delve even deeper.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. That was an awesome presentation. So you mentioned that it's the SEP1 gene that's related to thyroid.
So there's selenium, and so selenium is just with your health for thyroid. Their tyrosine is more closely related to your thyroid, like directly related to the thyroid, but the SEP1 because of the selenium connection to thyroid.
And then you also mentioned, so you test TGF beta on your patients, and you also mentioned upregulated IL-6. So I assume you also look at CRP as well.
Yes, HSCRP, always the high sensitivity is what I look at. And then the TGF beta, homocysteine, those are the key inflammatory markers besides like your basic metabolic lipid panels, those sort of things. But always checking that TGF beta and the HSCRP and homocysteine.
And then you said the MTHFR plays a big role in hair loss. Do you know, is it more of the C, because I have the homozygous C677T, and then, but there's also the 1298. Is right. I'm guessing it's more associated with the C677T?
For the most part, what's interesting that what I have found with people that I work with, they don't fit into that clinical text box of there's one that's supposed to be more associated with your neurotransmitters and the other more with your methylation and inflammation. I am not actually seeing that with people that I work with. So a lot of the studies are showing it, but I just am not, it's not been correlating with me. It's about half and half. So that more than likely, yes, but I just haven't seen it with the people that I work with.
Okay, great. And that was interesting also about the SOD catalase gene, the relationship with premature graying of the hair. Mm-hmm. So that was interesting. Yeah, just a lot of great information. So thanks again for the presentation. And before we dive into some of the questions from those attending, including the ones that were emailed, Julie, are there any questions that you have?
I mean, if genes alone explained hair loss, then the incident, why is the incidence of hair loss rising all over the world? Mm-hmm. And why is one genetically identical twin, going bald and the other does not? And why are people moving to the US from third world countries reporting massive hair loss and they have no genetic or family history of it? And why are 60% of the college students in China now reporting hair loss, whereas hair loss rates were very low before? I mean, 20 years ago, doctors, that's how they would explain hair loss, is that it's your genes and you can't do anything about it. But epigenetics has really changed all that. And that's exactly what Salena was talking about in a very detailed, technical way. So I'm just trying to explain a little more simply, but that was very interesting. And again, with the latest research, epigenetics is really revolutionizing not only hair loss, why it happens, but a lot of other diseases. And it's, I mean, it's definitely loading the gun. The genes are loading the gun, but our lifestyle is pulling that trigger.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. I mean, environmental factors are, of course, huge with all different types of condition, not just hair loss. But yeah, you're right. I mean, genetics. That was what this focused on, but yeah, you definitely got to tie in both the environment and the genes. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Julie. Before we dive into questions, also, if you could one more time, Julie, and then Salena, let people know also where they could find you too.
Okay. They can go to my website. Well, womanshairlossexpert.com. It's a website just for hair loss that both Salena and I, you can find us there. womanshairlossexpert.com.
I'll put that, make sure to put that in the show notes as well. All right. So I guess what we could do is we have a question here and then we could dive into the email question. So this is more of I guess really a general question. How can we reduce or completely eliminate inflammation, which, very, very broad topic. And, I'm sure Salena and Julie would agree that there could be many different sources of inflammation. And, so the key is really trying to find the source. And of course, you could do a lot of things, diet, from a diet and lifestyle perspective, doing things to reduce your toxic load. And there could be infections, there could be exposure to toxic mold. I mean, so sometimes it really depends on the person. I know I've had, I've seen situations, I also test CRP, which is not a perfect marker. You could have negative CRP and still have inflammation, but right. I've had people where, they have elevated CRP and then we make some changes, diet, lifestyle, improve their adrenal health, their gut health, and CRP normalizes. And then I've had some tough cookies where, we do those changes and then we do a retest and CRP is still elevated. And it's like, okay, what's missing here? Is there an underlying infection or is there something else going on? So it's not always easy, but definitely I would recommend at least start with the basics. And of course, I'm going to be biased and recommend working with, a healthcare practitioner, whether it's me or Julie or Salena or someone else. But because again, it can be challenging to at times find the source of the inflammation. So I don't know if either one of you have anything to add.
Basically the same thing. I would echo all of that. The biggest one that I've started recently noticing lately is the heavy metal component. That mercury fillings is something that has to be addressed. If you know that you have any sort of current toxin or stressful relationships, toxic relationships, you cannot reduce inflammation if you still have a gas leak going on. So, it's really crucial to find the source of that and doing whatever you have to remove that. If you try to tame down inflammation while you still have a gas leak, it's not going to work. You would never bring in builders to rebuild your house with a fire still going on. So I would just totally, stress and echo what you just said, Doctor.
Thanks.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's all very well said, and just be patient with it. Working with any of us will take the time to do the detective work, whereas a conventional doctor doesn't have the know-how or the tools to do that. So just be patient, because you don't want to put a Band-Aid over it and not get to the root cause of why you have that inflammation. It's probably more than one cause.
Yeah, I agree. Usually there are multiple triggers, multiple imbalances. So I'm glad you mentioned that as well. And so Anne actually has a question here. Interesting presentation for sure and so well documented, but DHT seems to bring relief according to some research. How does that tie into what you have reviewed in detail? So I don't know.
Okay. Do you want to talk to Julie about the DHT at all?
You go ahead and I'll add on to it.
Okay. So basically that's going to be part of the sex hormones, your androgenic hormones. So that's helping you. You're saying that the DHT, there's usually like a high DHT in most women, right? So if that's bringing you relief, that would tell me there's some other areas where you've got things that are very, very low. So there can be some extra inhibitors of different parts of the pathways. I would be looking, when you have something that kind of fits that it's not the norm, I would be looking elsewhere as to where these pathways blocked, doing testing to find out specifically what's going on nutrient wise, because that just seems to me that that's kind of backwards with most of the DHT having most of the elevation on the DHT.
Okay, and I did come across some research saying that DHT can calm the inflammation, but the problem is the way it calms it is it does calcification, and it puts like it's scarring in your hair follicles. So it might calm the inflammation, but it makes your hair loss worse. And if you get that scarring in your hair follicles, it becomes a lot more difficult to regrow your hair.
Is that where it comes in with the TGF beta, with the elevated TGF beta and the fibrosis?
That's what I was sending you last night.
Okay, I'm like, what is, I'm like, but just hold on a second. Just, yeah. So that would be where the IL-6 is super important, and why I check TGF beta and that HSCRP and your homocysteine. So the HSCRP is kind of an indirect marker of your IL-6 levels. You can't really measure the IL-6 that's where you need to be measured at. The IL-6 that you do get measured, it's not inside the mitochondria. It's not inside these processes where that elevated IL-6 is. Your HSCRP is more of a kind of an indirect marker of that. So when you have that TGF beta, the IL-6 upregulation, and if you have that TGF beta that's crazy high, certain things that may be anti-inflammatory actually will propel that inflammation and lead to more chronic inflammation, that fibrosis and that sort of a thing. So that's where, if there is that DHT on one component, you're not looking at that bigger picture of, okay, what's the context? Like if you have other areas that, okay, it's fine, then sure, that DHT may be very, very helpful, but you have to look at the context and looking at that bigger picture.
Good question.
Yeah. Thanks, Ann. So let's I think that's it for, at least for now, for live questions. So let's dive into some of the questions that I was emailed. So this first one, so Lucy has Hashimoto's, suffered from hair loss for 3.5 years, which began 6 months before she was diagnosed. I finally found out that I've been estrogen dominant, and since she's been taking DIM and calcium D-glucarate supplements, and since she's been taking those, her hair loss has rapidly stopped and my hair is growing back. Yeah. So my questions are as follows: how common is estrogen dominance related hair loss? And then the follow-up question is, I'm planning to take these supplements for at least 3 months, but I'm unsure what to do after that. Do you think a gut cleanse would help to rectify the problem of estrogen dominance so that I could hopefully stop needing the supplements?
Yeah, so that goes right where I was taught that COMT gene. So that COMT gene is typically a down regulation. And so you will build up you can't clear out that estrogen, and it leads to estrogen dominance. So it fits perfectly with your experience of, you fix that estrogen, you fix that pathway. Now you can detox and metabolize estrogen properly. Now you no longer have the hair loss. It's very, very much connected. And so long term, though, you want to figure out why, beyond just that COMT gene, what else is there? Gut is always where I start and where Julie starts. You have to fix why the body's not getting the nutrients, because the nutrients are how we can modulate our genes and how we can support those genes. That might be a 1 or 2 lane highway. If we keep them nurtured, they will work perfectly fine. And especially if we reduce any sort of outside inflammation or triggers or toxins. But yeah, so long term, I would probably, without knowing a lot more about the history, what happened, 4 years ago, what was it that happened? You said it was 3 years ago. Is that what she said?
Dr. Eric, 3 years ago, it sounds like it.
Yeah, suffered hair loss for 3.5 years.
So I would be wondering what happened 4.5 years ago. A lot of times you'll find that part, 6 months to a year prior to your major symptoms. That can be a huge component to, okay, this is what you need to fix, or this is what led to that trickle down effect. But gut health for sure is where I would definitely be looking.
And then I want to add what we do in our practice is we start with a questionnaire that puts together your own personalized timeline and health matrix. And that's where we can look at what happened 3-4 years ago with you and start putting the pieces together.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be very valuable to move forward.
So in this situation, do you also look at, do you do a comprehensive stool panel where you look to see if like beta glucuronidase is elevated, for example?
Yeah, we
Yep.
we start first with the timeline and the questionnaire, and from there determine what labs this, I don't know her name. Each person, it's tailored to each person's how they answer the questionnaire, or what labs we give them or not.
But on this stool test, it would be the beta glucuronidase. You're going to be looking at your calprotectin, what's going on with your enzymes, what's the microbiome, what's going on there, looking for things like your Akkermansia. Do you have enough of that? Your bifidobacterium, the bifidobacterium longum is especially important for detoxifying and for your estrogen and for a healthy estrogen metabolism. So looking at all of those kinds of things whenever you do look at the gut would be some of the things that we'd be looking at.
All right, wonderful. So next question is from Janet. I was diagnosed with hyperthyroidism, and I was wondering, how long does it take for hair loss to stop and grow back? I know everyone is different, but I'm hoping you could give me an average length of time. Which I think you'd agree it's probably it is different, obviously, with every
totally
person.
different.
There's not a specific period of time.
So typically in most situations, I'm usually looking at 3-month increments. A lot of that has to do with your 90 to 120 day life cycle of your red blood cells. So sometimes you can see things start to happen a lot sooner, but usually 3 to 4 months increments. And okay, they didn't happen this 3 months, well, then the next 3 months or the next 3 months. And so that's probably the closest that I would say, because it is so unique. It's just very unique. It depends on how well you can identify, oh, I had leaking mercury fillings. We get those removed, boom. Now we got that fixed. Or like what I think it was Amy just said, oh, she started cleaning her out. She had estrogen dominance. She took care of that and it's already happening. So if you know your reason why, it can be really quickly, but sometimes it's not that simple of that. You don't always hit a home run the first time. Sometimes you got to hit a lot of singles. And so it varies.
Yeah, I will say if the cause is hyperthyroidism, now, of course, you want to find out what's causing the hyperthyroidism. But if it's, let's say the person's hyper and they're losing hair and then you're controlling the hyperthyroidism, in some cases, you might be able to stop the hair loss quickly. It depends. Sometimes a person will take antithyroid medication and that might help. Sometimes people take antithyroid medication and could actually make it worse. But then as far as the growing back part, usually you'll need to kind of keep it in balance for a while. And that all comes down to, again, addressing the cause of the problem. So let's see. Next question is from Sabrina. So another Hashimoto's patient. So as a Hashimoto's patient, my hormones have been messed up for decades. I started losing a lot of hair when my mom lost her control. Okay, I don't know if I should if I should read this. Anyway, so she had an emotional attack, continued well into my adulthood until we spent a few solid years to reconcile and heal. So for someone who has been shedding tons of hair for many years, is it possible to stop that process?
That one sounds to me like the stress. And so I've got a client I'm working with in Indiana, and major childhood stress. And you can tell you can sometimes fix that. The emotional stresses are very real, and they can affect us in many ways. This particular person was not hair loss, but it's still whatever that stress will shut down your GI tract. You're not going to get nutrients. And so for you, it could be that your genes, the metabolic genes that the hair is important with, those are greatly affected because they're just not getting the nutrients because of any of that trauma, any of that emotional stress. So that kind of part is having really good, not really stress management, but emotional healing, like whatever works for you. There's a lot of different modalities, but that stress component is probably going to be a huge thing. And it also goes to the digestive variants that I talked about in the very beginning, because if you have a lot of those digestive variants, your GI tract is already a one-lane highway. When you add stress to that, there's no buffer. There's no like room to grow or room on that. And so it hits you really, really hard. And so when there's been some emotional stress that you know that, hey, that was the trigger, digestive health is super important. Self-care is absolutely 100% vital. Those kinds of things are going to be definitely necessary to help recover the hair.
And I want to mention 10 years ago, before I got into this line of work, I was losing my hair like crazy, and stress was a major component. And what happened, it was a cascade. So the stress, and then I found out I was very gluten intolerant. I became anemic. I wasn't absorbing my nutrients at all, eating like crazy. But there's hope. There's ways to resolve it, as I did. And so don't get discouraged, and just keep moving forward, and know that you can grow your hair back.
And that's true even if someone's been having it for many years, because I think that was Sabrina's concern, is that she's had it for so long. So she was concerned if she's had it for decades, the hair loss, whether or not she could address that. And it sounds like the answer is yes.
In most situations, there can be atrophy sometimes. So, I mean, I would not give up hope. I mean, I would definitely pursue that. But I mean, you can't always, I guess, say there's always 100% absolute. There's always exceptions to everything.
Sure.
But I would be very hopeful for it, yes.
All right. Then Maya also has a question about hair loss. I read that evening primrose oil is good for hair loss with hyperthyroidism, and I take 1,300 milligrams twice per day. It does help with shedding, but it doesn't seem to regrow the hair. What can I do for more regrowth?
So I would be looking into more as why. So when you talk about the evening primrose, that's going to be one of those omega-6s pathways and your fatty acids. So if that was a deficiency and it helps stop the shedding, but you're not getting to the other side of regrowth, there's probably still some other nutrients that I would be looking at as to what else is the body missing? What else is it needing to help with resolving inflammation, but then repairing? You got to have that repair stage and that growth stage.
All right. And then Brenda asks, how do you know if your hair loss is related to hormones, the gut, or something else?
You can take the quiz on our website. And that website it's the short version of it is julieolson.net, OLSON.net. But on the homepage and on the hair loss page, you can find a quiz.
I think it's on the women's expert page now too, right?
Oh, it is under resources. Yeah. But
Okay.
it is important to find out what type of hair loss you have, because there's different solutions to different, depending on what type of hair loss you have. And sometimes it crosses over, but that's really a good place to start.
And then after that, it's more just looking at testing, looking at your history, looking at your symptoms, putting all those things together, your genetics to see, do you have a genetic predisposition? All of it goes together to really decide, okay, what is the cause here? What's your kind of your source?
And I guess one thing I'll add is, let's say if the person's, having hair loss and they do a dried urine test, Dutch test, and it's showing problems with estrogen metabolism, and then they do a stool panel and there's elevated beta glucuronidase and a lot of dysbiosis. There's no guarantee that's what's causing the hair loss, but you'd want to fix those problems anyway, and hopefully by addressing those imbalances, as well as maybe others too, because I do comprehensive blood testing. So if the person had an iron deficiency, of course you would want to address that, but you might be addressing that through the gut, because you'd want to ask, why does that person have that iron deficiency? Is it because they're not getting enough iron? Is it because they're menstruating? Or is it because that they have a gut issue? So yeah, sometimes it's not easy to find out the cause right away. So you're finding out certain imbalances that might relate to the hair loss. And then of course you're going to address those imbalances and hope that fixes the problem.
Yep.
All right. So those are all the questions that were emailed, and at least it looks like there are no more live questions. So are there any last thoughts that either one of you have? So I guess, what's the next step? Like, what are the steps you would recommend? A few maybe action steps for those who are experiencing hair loss. Should they obviously work with someone would be ideal, but maybe some things on their own. Would you agree? Maybe look into the like changing their diet, changing their lifestyle, maybe look into doing some of the testing that you mentioned?
Yeah. Go ahead, Salena.
Oh, nope. So for me, stress is one of the top things, or any sort of toxic burdens. Those things are going to put you in a sympathetic state, which is that stressful fight or flight mode. So you cannot rejuvenate if you are stuck in a sympathetic state. So stress is a big one to address, whether it's emotional stress, work stress, money stress, whatever it happens to be, finding some sort of relief from that and self-care, and then reducing exposures to toxins, whether it's toxic relationships, it's heavy metals. Those are like a foundation to lay no matter what kind of imbalance, whether it's hormone related or gut health related or strictly genetic related. It doesn't matter. You have to first lay that foundation. Eating real foods. There's not a perfect diet. It's eating real healthy foods. So avoiding processed foods, getting enough sleep, like just your basic foundation. If you've done those things and you're not making progress, I cannot stress enough, as what Dr. Erica said, you really need to work with a practitioner. Get someone else to help you uncover those clues. Be a detective, work with you to find out what is going on, because we have to have that foundation. And if you're not making progress from that, it's going to be a lot deeper issue.
Right. And you can waste a lot of time and money trying different supplements and labs that aren't necessary. A couple of quick little fun hacks. You need circulation getting to your scalp to get the nutrients. Mm-hmm. So like standing on your hands, standing on your head, do an inversion table. Massaging your scalp is really good every night. And even a silk pillowcase is good for your not only your hair, but your skin on your face, and feels really good. It's just a couple of quick little.
The silk pillowcase was like a game changer for me whenever Julie told me about that. Oh my goodness. I have to get like all silk sheets and everything now. I'm just like, it makes a huge difference. My kids love them. I got them for my kids too. They're like, oh my goodness, Mom, these are awesome. Totally a silk pillowcase, 100%.
Silk pillowcase. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Need to consider.
Not polyester. They sell those all over the place, claiming they're like, they say for hair health and skin health, but it's not. You have to look at the tiny print and make sure it's 100% silk. Mm-hmm. It's a lot more expensive, but it's worth it.
And you got to hand wash them, or there's some you can machine wash, but you got to make sure you wash them separately and with gentle soap and stuff. We did ruin one of ours, but yes, definitely the silk pillowcase. Oh my goodness, it's amazing.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And yeah, make sure you visit their website to take that quiz as well. And can you say the web address one more time?
Well,
women's
JulieOlson.net
sure. Start there. JulieOlson.net.
Yeah, I know there's the other ones too. I forgot what's say that one more time. Women's
hair loss expert.com.
Okay, women's hair loss expert.com or JulieOlson.net. All right. Well, thank you. And Patricia says thank you. Well, thank you, Patricia. Thanks everyone for tuning in and for your questions, both the live questions and email. And thanks again, Julie, Salena. Appreciate it. Awesome presentation, Salena.
Thank you, Dr. Eric.